So welcome back. I have the honor and the pleasure of presenting the final panel of the conference. And even though our panelists today all have illustrious names that most of you will have known, will have heard, I'll just go through the panel individually and introduce everyone so you can put faces to names. And I can also give you the exact titles that each person has provided for the conference. So, Melanie Bono, Head of Programming Northwest Europe, Goethe-Institut, London. Christoph Jankowski, Head of Culture of Creative Europe Desk, UK, England, and Culture Advisor, UK. Having two hats on, basically, the British Council and Creative Europe, and he'll tell us more about both of those things later. Jonathan Meth, writer, director, cultural producer, founder of Writer Net, an organization some of you might remember, and an international network of writers and dramaturgs defense. Jonathan will also talk a bit more about these initiatives. Then we have Tarek Iskander, Interim Director of Theatre Arts Council England, and may I say, incoming Artistic Director of Battersea Arts Centre from June? May. And Lynn Gardner, Theatre Critic. I'm sure you all know Lynn. So, my name is Duska Radosavljevic. I'm a dramaturg and academic based here at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. I'm experiencing a bit of a déjà vu introducing this panel, which is entitled European Theatre Post-Brexit, What Next? Because I was actually chairing a similar panel under the same title 2 years ago with a selection of British theatre makers trying to look to the future after Brexit. And on that occasion, so being asked to think about the Brexit and being a person from the former Yugoslavia, I kind of expressed a feeling of sort of identifying a kind of Cassandra, you know, having experienced this problem of disunion and disintegration once before, and sort of crying out for somebody to stop this car crash. However, the panelists we have today are all people of action. So I'm hoping that by the end of this hour we've been allocated for this panel, we will have all the answers about what to do. We have a number of different sort of areas of expertise and different perspectives on this issue. So I have asked Lynn to start with perhaps addressing, before getting to some of those answers and ideas for what to do after Brexit, to reflect briefly on this central question of the conference, which has been about why there are so few European plays on the British stage. And has this been your experience based on the fact that you've probably seen more theatre in Britain than anyone here? So how have you kind of dealt with this perception?
Well, I'm not sure how I've actually dealt. I think I'm going to be one of those really irritating people who hasn't been to any of the sessions of the conference. And you probably actually all know much more than I know, I rather suspect. So I just had a few sort of thoughts, which was, I simply don't know. My experience is absolutely that I see very few plays of European plays in translation on British stages. I would also say that I am old enough that I come from a kind of era really prior to kind of Lift and Barbican Bite seasons, so where quite simply it was possible to spend an entire year watching British theatre and see practically nothing from Europe at all. But I suppose the question that I would ask, and it's a question and I'm sure more of you know the answer, is Are there many more British playwrights? My suspicion is that there is, because many British playwrights, that's how they earn their living, are produced in Europe than European theatres, European playwrights are produced in the UK. I also wonder whether there is a large element about the fact that we're actually really just so rubbish at languages, and that, of course, begins at school, and that actually means that people are really just not equipped to either read or see plays in their original language. Could it be that British playwrights are actually better than many European playwrights, or do they just think that they are? Is Europe better at directing than it is at writing? And is there also something about a different kind of sensibility that takes place? I mean, I'm sort of quite interested in the huge success of Florian Zeller, for example, in this country, kind of a European playwright who has just not cracked British theatre, but has cracked the West End. When I think of how many other kind of contemporary French plays land on our stages, often even when they do, actually there's something kind of quite interesting that they feel out of place. They often feel quite whimsical. They don't seem to kind of quite fit. I think there's a real thing about playwrights needing champions. Any playwright absolutely needs a champion, whether they're a British playwright or they are a they are a European playwright. And maybe European playwrights just simply don't have enough champions, particularly within theatre buildings. Not just in terms of kind of literary managers, but also actually directors who want to direct their plays. Might we see less rather than more post-Brexit? Well, I suppose that's a possibility. I tell you what I'm also interested in. I'm interested in the recent rows that some of you will probably have been following that have erupted around National Theatre Wales and also in Ireland around the Abbey, which is considered the Irish kind of the Irish National Theatre, and I wonder whether there is something that is increasingly going on whereby playwrights from Wales or from Ireland, or possibly could happen in the in the English National Theatre, and in Scotland feel really strongly that it is playwrights from those areas who should be supported. And I guess just the last thing I'd say, gosh, it's hard enough to actually get any new play onto a British stage because theatres are so risk adverse about putting on a play by somebody they don't know. And I guess that's going to make the sell, or theatres think that the sell for European work is even harder.
Thank you. Tarek, as someone who is currently working at the Arts Council, but you have had a lot of different hats and are about to take on another one, can we hear a bit more from your perspective about some of these issues that Lynn has raised in terms of the lack of sort of institutional support for European plays on the British stage?
I mean, I think Lynn's raised some really good points and also really provocative points, which I think is a really good place to start. I mean, I guess I'm trying to put myself in the mindset of someone who has to make a decision about what to put on in a production, and either as a festival director or as someone in a building. And I guess from what I observed, there are probably three things that are paramount in that thought process at various points. One is, can you get the creative team? Do you have the artists? Do you have the people around who want to make something or really passionate about something because you want the quality good? And that goes back to Lynn's point about champions. Are there enough champions within those organizations who care a lot about European plays? And that goes back to education, goes back to international exchange, all sorts of things. So I think that's one thing that's going through my mind. Second one is, at the moment, a lot of subsidized theatre organizations are really focused on how they can increase representation within the arts. We know that, you know, those large swathes of the population who don't benefit in the arts, don't participate, aren't part of that. And I guess that's in the forefront of many people's minds. And I confess, when I looked at the question that you posed in this conference, a part of me felt like that's a very old-fashioned kind of question, because actually what people are really focusing on is how do we engage people. Sometimes that involves plays, but sometimes it involves participative work, involves co-created work, involves a whole swathe of things. So to kind of look at plays specifically within that context, European or otherwise, seems a very specific focus. And finally, subsidy is not in the most robust health at the moment. There isn't a huge amount of money swilling around. Whether that makes organizations risk averse or not, I don't know, but it certainly means that public subsidy is one small percentage of what these organizations are thinking about. So commercial aspects, what is going to sell, what is going to bring people in, is also a big factor. So I guess the question to throw back is, how do European plays fit within those three questions that programmers are having to grapple with on a day-to-day basis?
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, you have over the years initiated a number of projects that were designed to sort of create networks across and between the UK and various European countries. Where did those initiatives come from for you, and how did you find they panned out in terms of funding, support, and any other sources of support that you could muster?
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the FANCS network, which was set up 15 years ago, and I'll talk briefly about why I was moved to try and create something that I thought, as a mechanism, might be a little bit different than the way in which Lynn and Tarek have outlined, if you like, some of the structures within the landscape in the UK. I'm hybrid. So I have this nice kind of white male majority exterior. I'm also of a certain age, so I fit very comfortably, to all intents and purposes, in that box. But I'm also Jewish, I'm also the son of a refugee, my father was disabled, I have a disabled son. So actually, once you start breaking things down, you realise that that veneer doesn't quite necessarily define who I am. And I needed to find a way of being in the theatre that allowed me to be all the different sub-personalities and the influences and interests that they bring to me. Partly because when I talk to artists, that's my sense of how they see themselves and the world as well. And partly because I recognised that we are not set up as a culture in our politics, in our institutions, in our infrastructure, in our economics, to deliver a kind of internationalism of which Europeanism might also be part of the wider Venn diagram. I simply said, what else can I do? On a very practical level, I ran WriterNet. WriterNet had a responsibility for supporting a grassroots playwriting culture across the UK. I went to the IETM, which many people will know as the largest dance and drama network for professionals working in the sector, 20 years ago in Vienna. 600 people, and a lot of interesting ideas, and a kind of quasi-marketplace. And I asked myself the question, how on earth might a playwright enter into this particular landscape? And I kind of went, well, a few would be fine, but most wouldn't be seen dead. They'd be in a corner with each other having a coffee or a beer. And I thought, okay, maybe if I could create a mechanism that would allow playwrights, but not just playwrights, also let's call them cultural operators, producers, directors, dramaturgs, translators, academics, anyone that's interested in the playwright as a central unit. What would happen if I could create a group of those, perhaps from different European countries, and that rather than a bilateral collaborative process, which is what the structures, the funding structures, politically, economically, drive you towards, we might construct something that was multilateral and therefore didn't have a central point of control, but actually was deliberately polyvalent, where you had to engage with a range of different system structures and views. One of my other hats is that I teach cultural policy at Goldsmiths, and so I'm interested and curious about the cultural context in which things get made. So infusing all those things, I then moved towards creating a network. I was opportunist, and I was able to access European funding, not from Creative Europe, nor from Erasmus+, but actually from equal, so structural funding, labour market funding designed to remove barriers to the workplace on the grounds of gender, disability and ethnicity. And this is where our own domestic preoccupations around diversifying the workforce meet with potentially an internationalist and European agenda. I was unable to persuade the British Council and Métier, who at that time were the national training organisation for our sector, a precursor of the current system, but nonetheless the same, so sector-wide responsibility. And we set the network up, and the network was partly, in my view, as a response to playwrights telling me that they wanted to internationalise their practice. But unless they were part of the Royal Court, sometimes the Gate, in those days the Traverse, and from time to time the National Theatre Studio, particularly under Philippe Lemoine, for example, back in the days, that was it. Unless your agent thought you worthy of being networked into the German-speaking market, essentially the default position for a non-UK-based play was across the pond to the States. Now, my dad was from Vienna, so I grew up with a different kind of cultural imperialist model, the Habsburg, to set alongside our own, right? And I talk about empire because it's important, because I think it relates to why we are where we are. But maybe we'll come back to that. Is that enough about me blathering on about some of the origins? So that's what motivated me. What's happened is in the intervening 15 years, we've had 25 network meetings. They're self-organising. We don't deliberately rely on funding sources. We make work between ourselves as a kind of part of what I might call a slow networking movement that operates counter to some of the dominant systems and structures. This seems to work. It seems to be sustainable. I guess it has resilience because it's low res. And it acts as a vehicle for the professional development of its constituent parts.
Thank you. Christoph, I actually had a little bit of a chat with you before about the fact that you also are someone coming from outside the UK, so you are originally from Belgium, but have already some different roots in the mix already. You are here today on behalf of the British Council and a different initiative called Creative Europe that you have been involved with for a few years. What kind of structures or what kind of personal motivations have informed your activity on behalf of these companies? Sorry, big question.
It is.
Yeah.
Sure. It's a question everyone should ask themselves after a long year. What am I still doing here, doing this kind of work, being who I am, and who am I? I'm not going to get into that too much. I'll say a few things about Creative Europe, first of all. It is an EU program, it's an EU funding program, but the way that I and my team like to talk about it is that it's more of a collaboration program. Yes, the money's there, yes, the money is good, but what the money does and what it allows people to do and organizations to do and what that gives artists the range and the possibility to do vastly outweighs the financial value of all of this. We've got a fantastic impact report that we just wrote last summer, which kind of ties down how the money compares to the effects of the money. And this is sort of in a big time where, with Brexit going on, there are big questions going on, and even before Brexit, where there was always a kind of question of, oh, so how much do we put in, and how much do we get out, and how much goes away, and how much it comes back, and then along came the question of, oh, well, maybe we can take it all back. Maybe we can do this on our own. Maybe we can just, all this money that we give to the EU, we can just spend it ourselves the way that Arts Council England might allocate it for European international funding or any of the others. And what might that look like? Bearing in mind that this program is a very multilateral program, there are 41 European countries in this program, so it isn't something that you really can easily replicate from one country on your own. But I'll get into that a little bit later, maybe over a glass of wine or two. With Jonathan and I talk quite a bit and quite often, so I'll try not to go in too much to what he did. I'll talk a little bit about what the program's done in the UK. The value of Creative Europe in the UK is 72 million euros in the last 3 years. That's about 5 million euros on average just for the culture side of things. That has supported about 200 UK-based organisations, theatres, heritage institutions, dance companies, production centres, festivals, to work in partnership with friends and colleagues from other European countries. It is a deeply multilateral program. This is not bilateral, so I'm kind of divorcing this from what I might say about the British Council in a second. You need to have at least 3 partners in the mix, and the idea with this is that the more mobility, the more ideas, the more languages, the more viewpoints that are in the mix, the more exponentially diverse you can make what you do and how you go about it. What's being funded here is not the outcome. It's not, we want to see 5 plays on 3 stages in 6 different countries. It doesn't at all work like that. It's about the process. Mm-hmm. So what these organizations and partner organizations are committing to is over 2, 3, 4 years to ask some big questions or to put forward some really difficult questions. And they may ask artists, playwrights, to deal with these questions. How do you see, as a performing or visual artist, climate change? And how do you see that relating to our experience as a theatre goer or not quite yet theatre goer, for example? It may be looking at issues of access and disability, what that means for arts and cultural organizations and institutions, and getting them to grapple with how do we do it in Greece? How do the Germans interpret that? And how might that inform our already, we think, relatively forward-thinking way of dealing with things in the UK? So it's something that refreshes, I think, everyone in the mix. It challenges everyone. It isn't there to necessarily put a European par on everything, but it does, I like to think, try and set the bar a little bit higher, and give people a little bit more of an insight of what similar ideas might be flavored like in other European countries, and therefore give us all a little bit more ambition as to how we may want to do it now or in the future. I could say 5 million other things, but
I'll come back to that future bit in a bit.
Yeah.
Melanie, you're here on behalf of the Goethe-Institut, and the Goethe-Institut has already been mentioned in the conference in a very good light. We're all aspiring to this German model of funding. In preparation for this panel, you suggested that you would actually like to talk more about the future rather than the central question of the conference. So I will now start the round of questions about the future and looking to what next.
Yeah, I mean, it's very nice to hear that the Goethe-Institut has already been mentioned, because, and that's what was my purpose behind saying I would like to talk about the future, because I think the work of the Goethe-Institut in fostering translations and the work we do usually, I mean, I think has been recognized and will of course go on, but obviously the Brexit vote has been some crucial point also for the Goethe-Institut, and actually is, to break it down very shortly, kind of a wake-up call for us to even, enable and facilitate even more cultural exchange and even and to do more in the UK or in Britain. And since the work of the Goethe-Institut is very much similar to Creative Europe and the values that you just presented, it's very much about enabling encounters between individual artists, about facilitating exchange of artistic practices and discourses on all different levels of artistic productions, and also like giving or making the way into the German theater scene and to see what's going on there. And we have always been working very closely with local partners. It's our approach not to be in the first place presenting German art abroad or something like that, but very much to have partners, to listen to them, to their questions, to the issues that are going on, and then trying to bridge or something with German facilitators. And also like at Creative Europe, in the last few years, we have been trying to open this bilateral approach up to something that's more multilateral, and to be working more as a platform, to have a broader exchange of perspective and views. So we're going to enforce that in the future. And we've always been working a lot in the UK with theatres, but also with festivals, with individual artists on different levels, with also with educational institutions, with emerging artists. So we have been engaged, we feel at least, quite on very different levels, and obviously have supported and still are supporting translations of German plays. Not always with just to have them translated and to make them known. It's not always related to some kind of performance. So our partners can ask us, we would be interested in this and this playwright. Would it be possible to translate it? We wouldn't tie any kind of performance or staging directly to it, obviously. We have residencies, we are funding research travel, we are funding even job shadowing opportunities in Germany to just foster this exchange. And just this year, in 2019, we're starting a new 2-year exchange program between the Royal Court and the Schaubühne in Berlin for young playwrights that will have a series of workshops, and they can exchange during their writing process about their approach and the proceedings of their work. So obviously that's what we're going to continue with our work. But the European situation has changed dramatically. I think I don't have to repeat what has happened. It's not only Brexit, it's also the tendency to more repressive politics in Eastern Europe. It's in a broader horizon, also what's happening in the US or just lately happened in Brazil. So we have the feeling that a lot of long-standing values that we used to share in a broader sense are on the line. And so the Goethe-Institut has been asking itself, how can we have more discourse and more exchange? And if it's even just to not fall behind all our achievements that we have built up after the Second World War, because that's sad enough to say, but that's kind of the point that where are we now. And so the Goethe-Institut has been revisiting its own approach, especially in the UK, but also outside. And one of the decisions we made is not to be engaging only in London so much anymore, but to go more out and have more cooperations. So we will actually have a cooperation with the National Theatre in Wales to have an exchange between British and German dramaturgs. Lynn and I just talked briefly before the talk about how the role of the dramaturgs in Germany is very different from the one in British theatres, and we are looking to work more inclusively, to see how we can reach more and different audiences that might not have been in contact with theatre work at all. And we're thinking about starting a huge project in the second half of this year to invite theatre makers and institutions from all over the world, but especially from the UK and Germany, to meet on a platform or something to exchange about what has happened, because there has been happening a lot, trying to engage new audiences in the last decades, and how what went well, what didn't, and what would make sense to develop for the future. So we are very much looking forward to this kind of discourse. And on a very practical level, we're going to have an event week by the end of March, obviously. We also commissioned a performance by a German performance group, Basten Knoblich, titled Ghosting Europe, and they developed a performance around how to cope with emotions of loss. Too. That's, we're looking forward to this, but the whole week is going to be hosting events and discussions around obviously the relationship between UK and Germany, respective Europe in a broader sense, and we're very much determined to tighten the cultural ties now even more, since they are so, on this breaking point.
So, Sarah, this is the answer to what next. We will have to all come to your festival.
Please do.
Christoph, could you tell us what next from the point of view of the British Council and Creative Europe?
I'll start with Creative Europe because it's longer. Creative Europe being the EU program is obviously dependent on any new deals that may or may not be forthcoming. Plan A is that there's a transition period where the UK would continue paying into all of the EU programs, Erasmus+, Horizon 2020, Creative Europe, and so on and so forth, and then we would have a period of transition. The question around Plan B is what would happen if there was no such agreement, and whether there would be kind of a crash-out scenario. What does that mean? What would that mean? Again, Creative Europe is not a program only for EU member states. There are 11 non-EU countries that are part of it, more than 11. Tunisia, Ukraine are also part of it. Most Western Balkan countries are part of it. It's a very broadly European country that is open to the neighborhood of European countries to be part of it, just because the point is collaboration and not just sort of internal market dynamics and sort of supporting each other in the club. It's also about looking outwards. So there's a pretty big question mark. I think the difficulty has been for quite a few organizations in the last year is what should they be doing? What can they count on? How do they develop these partnerships, these collaborations? How do they take care of their friends and colleagues in other countries if you have this black cloud of so many possible things, but so many certain nothings out there? What can you do? And if you are an arts organization that kind of plans from year to year or 3-year stages, you don't really know where you'll be in 2 years' time already. So how on earth would you be able to commit to a partnership, a European partnership that could last for 3, 4, or something like that years? So it's put a lot of organizations in the UK under severe strain. And as this is a multilateral program, it's put all of their European partners under severe strain as well. How could a large German theatre, or even any German theatre, commit to programming or co-programming with a couple of other European venues or festivals, something where they don't really know what it might be like? What are we going to be talking about? Mobility, taxes, all these kinds of things. So I think, and Lynn may say something about that later on too, but it's been a strain, and I think, personally speaking, not Creative Europe or British Council-wise, I think there needs to be a bit of a rediscovery of these European connections that we have had, that we may have not been taking care of as well as we could have, for some of us. How would we make these kinds of, probably a big word for it, but reparations for ourselves and with others, and show that the UK is still, and the sectors, arts, culture, heritage, an incredibly internationable, curious, open, and often also in its methods and practices quite compelling partner in these kinds of things. So let's look at what we've done, how we've done it, why we've done it the way we have, and shape that into where we'd like to be in the next 5 or 10 years. There's a lot that is at stake. I'll give you a few numbers here. When I mentioned that there are 150 to 200 UK organisations who work in partnership with other European organisations, they are working in total with, in all of the other countries, with 743 arts, culture and heritage organisations. So the UK part of these kinds of partnerships is part of it. The rest of it is far bigger and far more important, and the UK sectors are far more networked than we give them credit for. than I think a lot of public funding expectations give them credit for or value these kinds of connections for. So this is, even just in terms of Creative Europe, at risk. Isn't quite what you were asking about. British Council, the British Council, I think, it's still seen by many organisations and people as a kind of grant-giving body to go international or to do British out in foreign, and that isn't really quite what the British Council in terms of its arts strategy does anymore. It is very much about reciprocity. The British Council will look at projects and initiatives that is interesting for its arts strategy, because it does have a very clear, defined one, and a pretty good one, and a very Brexit responsive one. I think due to funding constraints that all of us have and all of us work under, I think the historic experience of the British Council, oh, I'd like to go to Germany, Iceland for 2 weeks, would you fund me? That doesn't really work in that kind of a way anymore, sadly enough. And also the British Council's budget in Europe and in EU is under pressure just because of government directions and because of the way that international funding for development is done. So the British Council is moving much more into a direction of brokering, enabling, putting people together who should and could be put together. So this brokering role in and with the rest of Europe is one of the strongest suits, I think. And I think it invests much more in people than in very specific ideas. There's also, for a number of years with the Arts Council in the British Council, ran the Artist International Development Fund, which gave artists and artists working within organisations the opportunity to apply for small grants to go and see, to go and explore, to develop European networks, and maybe that will continue.
Thank you. Jonathan, I'm not going to ask you for pragmatic solutions to what next, but you can also offer some more sort of philosophical ones, if you like.
General soothsaying. Okay. I'll put my haruspecs on. There you go, there's my Latin gag for all of you. Look, I think it's impossible to know. Of course it's impossible to know. I mean, it could go so many different ways. What I suspect is that we've been living with the Brexit crisis for two and a half years, and everyone is very tired of it. And so there's the anticipation of the relief, at least, potentially, in some kind of, resolution. But if we can substitute the word fudge for resolution and perhaps work with that, what kind of a fudge will it be? But I think whatever happens is that in a way we'll then be into the next crisis. So what will the next crisis look like? What will its modalities be? If your question really is a shorthand for where will the funding flow differently, then I guess you've got to look at, well, what are the signals? So Theresa May talked about a kind of Festival of Britain 70 years on. The arts sector's got to decide whether it's up for that or whether it wants to fight it. And if it wants to fight it, does it want to harness its collective creativity towards an alternative? So if you've got fun palaces, a Joan Littlewood's idea that comes from the people but was not part of 1951, because actually fun palaces didn't make the cut and were a little bit too politically disturbing for the times, then what will the next iteration look like? What would be the compact between a government, a Tory government with some kind of fudge Brexit, with a new Festival of Britain? So it seems to me that however you think about it, really it's all variations for me on that question.
Thank you. Tarek.
So, I mean, I totally agree first that who knows what's going to happen in the next month, let alone, I mean, the Arts Council will obviously deal a lot with the Department of Culture, trying to support them with as much planning as possible from our perspective about what the impacts might be. I think it's very clear that most people aren't quite sure where this is going to go. There's a whole range of options that are possible. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I just wanted to pick up on that point. I suppose the question is what happens with the money, because the money effectively impacts directly on what happens in practice. I feel that, say, for English companies or artists or so on, that internationalism in its sense is a good thing. I think we all agree in this room that cultural exchange, international exchange is an absolute good in itself. So I think that's quite clear. There are other dimensions to it. One of the other dimensions is financial. So companies taking work abroad very often look to that as a way of bringing money into their own company, as a way of continuing succeeding. And historically, Europe has been a very important part of that. I get the sense, this is nothing but a personal sense, that there's already a shift in terms of thinking about exchange more with the USA, with Canada, with Australia, English-speaking countries, and also the Far East. And I get a sense that, Christoph, you will know much more than I get a sense the British Council is also looking at those opportunities more than they have been in the past in order to enable that. So there may be a shift, I think, in terms of who British theatre is engaging with internationally and how that kind of works. Saying that, though, I think there's also, we are a European country. I think everyone recognizes and acknowledges now, I suppose I'm speaking for the Arts Council a little bit, that international exchange and European exchange is so important for artistic development, for development of the art form of theatre and culture generally. And I think one of the things we are really thinking quite hard about currently in our new 10-year strategy, which is a lot about artist development and talent development, is what do we need to do to try to protect and support that so that we are bringing European work here into this country that can inspire people, as well as we are sending our artists to be inspired. And I can only speak personally, you know, when I was starting out as a director, going to Germany, going to Poland, I benefited from a couple of bursaries, completely changed the way that I thought about my own practice. So who knows what's going to happen? It feels like things might shift, and I guess the question is, what do we need to do collectively to protect what's really helpful to all of us?
I'm going to come back to what we can do collectively. Lynn.
If I said I knew, I would be lying. Nobody knows. But I guess that there are a few things, some of which have absolutely already been touched upon. I mean, it does depend very much on what kind of Brexit, indeed, that we do have. I certainly talked, for example, to a lot of Norwegian artists, and they are, still involved in the European Economic Area, and in fact, actually, being a Norwegian artist seems to be a very good place to be an artist in terms of your collaborations that you can make. But even if we do kind of crash out, I think that a lot of the relationships that are already established, and I think that's whether actually that they are between institutions and organisations, or indeed between individual artists, will continue. I think, as kind of Christoph was talking about, that often, in the same way that often when we talk about crowdfunding, that actually the really important word in those two words is in fact crowd, and about actually the relationships that you make through doing it, that I think one of the things around Creative Europe and other kind of pots of money which have been accessed by people have been that I think often British artists have completely sort of had their eyes open to the pleasures and benefits of collaboration with people from other cultures and other countries. So I just don't think those things will cease to happen overnight. Interestingly, a number of sort of the equivalents of the Goethe-Institut that I've talked to in other European countries have kind of said to me that they have sensed and felt that actually that some of the barriers have come down with British arts institutions, that suddenly, there is nothing like concentrating the mind to realise what you might be about to lose. And so institutions who in the past have kind of not been very interested in either having a collaboration or inviting work from particular countries are suddenly actually answering those emails. So I think those things might be very good. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that, goodness, that sort of thing, I don't know, we all have families, we all have times when people fall out in their families with each other, but I don't think Europe will close the door on us either, because actually, it is absolutely in the interests of arts organisations to collaborate across borders, and all those benefits that are brought, which are not necessarily kind of financial. I also think there's something actually, and I think Christoph, you kind of talk about that. I was in Brussels at a conference last year, and people were talking very much about the cultural budgets, which I think kick in 2020, and about the fact that actually very much that those budgets, or some of those budgets, are geared towards the fact of creating work which is made with communities, that is socially engaged, and actually one of the things that we in the UK are actually very much in advance on is in fact creating work in that area. So actually we have a lot that we could contribute in terms of doing that. Will there be financial repercussions? Of course there will be, I think, about what it is possible to apply for and where. But the one thing that I think has really, really changed in British theatre in the last kind of 10 years or so, 20 years, but certainly in the last 10 years, is absolutely, as Tarek mentioned, along kind of the international fund of people actually travelling outside these borders. And I think there is something, I think that so many young people, because of Brexit, feel so actually disenfranchised, and about the fact that they feel that their future has been taken away from them. I know several young artists who have started to learn either German or French and they had, or Spanish, and they hadn't in the past. And it makes me think that their determination actually to remain connected to Europe, because actually I've got children in their who are in their early 20s. They think of themselves as Europeans, and I think that will continue in theatre.
Great. I'd like to thank our panel and also the organizers for putting together such a wonderful conference that actually felt like a party to me most of the time. So thank you all.